He looked like a ghost, more shadow than man, haunting the ruins of what was once a proud homestead. Silas Whitmore stood in the doorway of his decaying farmhouse, the wind lifting dust around his boots, watching as 7 women made their way across his sun-baked fields. They came with purpose, their dark dresses stark against the washed-out morning sky, each step deliberate. But what struck Silas wasn't their arrival. It was the way they walked toward his dying ranch like it already belonged to them. The one leading them stopped a few paces from his porch. Her hands were folded calmly over a worn apron, her eyes steady and full of something Silas recognized. Sorrow wrapped in resolve. She looked at him not with pity, but with the kind of quiet knowing that unsettled a man. Like she could see straight through to the hollowed-out space where his heart used to be. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm Cora Maddox. We've come to help." Silas's jaw clenched. "Help?" he echoed, the word like ash on his tongue. He'd heard that word before, after Martha's funeral, when neighbors brought casseroles and whispered condolences before turning his grief into gossip and leaving him alone to rot. "Didn't ask for help?" he muttered, the edge in his voice sharper than he'd meant. The women didn't flinch. They stood like rooted trees, weathered but unmovable. Cora nodded, as though she'd expected the resistance. "No, you didn't. But we came anyway." She gestured toward the collapsed fence, the weed-choked garden, the barn door hanging half off its hinges. "When's the last time you ate something real?" The question hit like a blow to the ribs. Silas couldn't recall. Time had blurred into an endless fog of whiskey and sleep. Too proud to go into town, too broken to care if he wasted away entirely. "I thought so," Cora said gently. A younger woman stepped forward then, soft-eyed and carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and something warm, something that made his gut ache with forgotten hunger. "This is Mercy Harper," Cora said. "She's brought food, enough to keep you going for a while. But we're not just here to feed you, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes a man needs more than bread to keep him from dying slow." Silas nearly shut the door. Part of him wanted the solitude, the silence, the familiar ache of grief. But something in Cora's voice, some steady, quiet thread of understanding, stopped him cold. There was no judgment there, just truth. "What do you want from me?" he asked hoarsely. Cora smiled then, not kindly, not sweetly, but like a woman who'd walked through fire and come out stronger. "Nothing you're not ready to give. But what we're offering—" She paused, her eyes locked with his. "That just might save your life." Inside, the women moved like they belonged. Mercy set down the basket on the dusty table. Another, silver-haired and graceful, pumped water into the rusted sink without hesitation. A third, barely more than a girl, began gathering the empty bottles scattered like tombstones around the room. "Wait," Silas said, reaching for one. The girl met his eyes without fear or judgment, only a sad familiarity. "Jolene Burke," she introduced herself softly. "My husband drank himself to death without ever taking a sip. Grief swallowed him whole before the whiskey even touched his lips." She placed the bottle on the counter with care. "I know what drowning looks like, Mr. Whitmore, and I know that ain't the way out." Silas flushed with shame. These strangers, these women, were handling the wreckage of his life with gentle hands, like it was just another mess worth cleaning. Part of him burned with humiliation, but another part, a part buried with Martha, stirred with something else, relief. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, watching as the older woman, Hattie Vaughn, began restoring order to his forgotten kitchen. Cora turned from the pantry. "Because we've all lost everything too. Husbands to war, to disease, to drink. Some to cruelty. We've lived through fire, Silas. And we learned something along the way. Grief gets smaller when it's shared." As if summoned by her words, Martha's memory surged like a wave. Her laughter echoing off these same walls, her hands kneading bread at this table, her voice calling from the garden she loved. The pain was so sharp it bent him where he stood. "I don't know how to share it," he confessed in a ragged whisper. "Don't know how to be anymore." Mercy looked up from where she was slicing cornbread, her voice soft. Nobody expects you to know. That's why we're here. To remind you how. She handed him a slice, still warm. Start with this. When's the last time something tasted like life? Silas took a bite, and the world stopped. It tasted like mornings before the sorrow, like the hum of Martha's voice in a sunlit kitchen. Tears rose fast and unbidden. There's more, Cora said gently, watching him. So much more we can give you. But first you have to choose. Do you want to keep dying slow, or learn how to live again? Before he could answer, a girl appeared in the doorway. Barely 16, out of breath, fear in her eyes. Miss Cora, she gasped. 3 riders come in fast, and they don't look friendly. Through the shimmer of heat, they appeared, riders like vultures, circling the wounded. Silas recognized the lead one immediately. Caleb Dunn, collector of debts and land, with a reputation carved in threats. The men flanking him wore the hard expressions of hired guns, their hands never far from their triggers. Dunn pulled up near the porch, his voice slick and loud. Heard you had some company, Whitmore. Looks like the local charity case is throwing himself a housewarming. For the first time in months, Silas stood tall. The way Dunn looked at these women, his women, he realized with sudden clarity, stirred something fierce in him, something protective, alive. State your business, he said, stepping forward to block the man's view inside. Dunn grinned without warmth. Same as always. You're 3 months behind with Morrison's bank. Taxes due next week. Word is you've been drinking yourself to death. He leaned on his saddle. The bank's got buyers lined up. Good, cash buyers. Behind Silas, he heard the rustle of skirts. The women had come to stand with him, silent and strong. Cora stepped up beside him, her voice cool and commanding. Mr. Dunn, I believe you're mistaken. As you can see, Mr. Whitmore is no longer alone. He has help now. His affairs are being handled. Dunn barked out a laugh. Handled by a bunch of women. That's rich, Cora Maddox. Yeah, I know who you are. Know about your little collection of strays and broken things. But this ain't a soup kitchen. And this man ain't a cause you can save with cornbread and company. Maybe not, Cora replied calmly, her voice like still water with a current underneath. But either way, it's not your concern. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. The silence that followed was taut as a drawn bow. Silas saw Dunn's face tighten, saw the shift in his men's posture, the subtle movement of men used to violence, now bristling under a woman's command. These weren't men who backed down easy, especially not to women. You're making a mistake, Dunn warned, his tone turning to menace. Whitmore's finished. This land's as good as gone. If you ladies had any sense, you'd take your charity act somewhere safer. That's when Hattie Vaughn stepped forward. Her face was weathered but unafraid, carved from a life that had seen too much and yielded to none of it. She walked past the others with the unshakable calm of someone who had buried husbands, raised children, and still stood tall. And in that moment, Silas felt the chill of something ancient stir in his blood. Son, Hattie said to Dunn, her voice ringing out with matriarchal steel. You're about to learn why smart men don't threaten women who've got nothing left to lose. She reached into her apron, slow, deliberate, not with fear but with reverence, and drew out not a weapon, but a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and lined with care. She held it high so Dunn couldn't pretend not to see. Recognize this? She asked, her voice carrying across the yard like a church bell. It's a deed, signed and witnessed properly. This land was purchased, fair and legal, 18 years ago by one Martha Whitmore. God rest her soul. Paid in full, with money from her grandfather's mining claims in Colorado. Silas staggered under the weight of it. Martha? Mining money? She'd always said they'd saved every dollar working extra shifts and living on beans and determination. But as Hattie spoke, more pieces began to fall into place. Details he'd once overlooked now slotting into a clearer, sharper truth. Hattie unfolded the paper slowly, like she was holding someone's bones. She paid cash, every cent. That means there was never any debt to Morrison's bank. Never any lien. Just forged paperwork and shady dealings meant to steal this land from a man too grief-stricken to fight back. Dunn's face turned ashen, then flushed red, his mouth moving like he was chewing gravel. That's impossible, he muttered. I've seen the documents myself. You've seen lies? Cora cut in, stepping forward like a blade drawn from its sheath. There's no debt. There never was. Now Silas saw it, the truth of who these women were. Not just caretakers, not just comfort. They'd come with more than compassion. They'd come with a plan. And fire. We've been asking around, Mercy added, circling Dunn's horse with calm precision. Talking to folks, checking records. Amazing what people remember when they're no longer afraid. Near the barn, the youngest of them, Daisy Flynn, called out, her voice clear and certain, despite her youth. My uncle works in the county recorder's office. It's real interesting what files have gone missing lately, and which ones suddenly turned up with fresh ink. Silas watched Dunn begin to wither, the bravado bleeding out of him. He wasn't facing a grieving man anymore. He was facing something far more dangerous. Clever, coordinated women who knew the law better than he did, and weren't afraid of using it. You don't know what you're meddling in, Dunn hissed. But his voice had lost its edge. Morrison's got connections. Real ones. People who don't like being challenged. And we've got something Morrison doesn't, Cora said softly. The truth. And a town full of people sick of watching men like him steal what was never theirs. For the first time in months, something warm stirred in Silas's chest. Not just relief. Not just gratitude. But hope. These women hadn't come just to heal his house. They'd come to defend his legacy, and maybe even save his soul. But as he looked into Dunn's eyes, saw the bitter promise of revenge blooming behind them, Silas knew this wasn't over. You'll regret this, Dunn growled, yanking his reins. All of you. The riders vanished in a swirl of dust. Silas stood still, heart pounding, staring after them. Then turned to the women who had upended everything he thought he knew. How did you know? He asked Hattie, his voice cracked and hushed. She folded the deed with the same care as before, slipping it back into her apron. Because your Martha wasn't the only one with secrets, she said, her eyes meeting his. And sometimes the dead leave behind more than memories. The yard fell quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush of a truth settling into place. Silas looked at the crumbling fence, the dusty porch, the faces of these women who seemed to know more about his wife than he ever had. Martha never told me, he murmured. She always said we scraped by, that we earned this place. Cora stepped forward, her voice tender. Maybe she wanted to protect you. Maybe she knew if people found out she had money, they'd come for it. Come for you. But why lie to me? The question came from somewhere deep, raw with betrayal. I was her husband. I had a right to know. Mercy gently touched his arm, her voice full of old wisdom. Maybe she knew the weight of it would have crushed you. That kind of money. That kind of target. Not every man survives it. And then, as if summoned by her words, came the sound of distant hoofbeats. This time just one rider. Fast.
Urgent.
Jolene, standing watch, called out. It's Sheriff Garrett. And he's bringing something heavy with him. The sheriff rode hard, his horse lathered in sweat. He didn't even wait for it to stop fully before dismounting. His face pinched with worry. Silas, he said, tipping his hat toward the women. Ladies, I just came from town. There's talk. Morrison's been stirring things up. Claims you're harboring fugitives. Says he's calling in federal marshals. Silas blinked. Fugitives. He turned toward the women, confusion and dread battling in his chest. Angels or not, who had he let into his home? Garrett's eyes scanned their faces. Ladies, I have to ask, are any of you wanted by the law? Because if you are, and you're staying here, you've painted a target on this man's back. And they won't ask questions before putting him in a grave. Silence rippled through the group. A quiet tension passed between them like the flicker of firelight in a windstorm. Finally, Cora stepped forward, her jaw set. Sheriff, she said, her voice low and steady. We are survivors. That's what we are. We've helped neighbors who were hurting. If that makes us fugitives to men like Morrison, then maybe it's time this town knew exactly what kind of man's been sitting behind their bank desk. Garrett exhaled slowly. That's a fine sentiment, ma'am. But federal marshals don't come looking for sentiment. They come looking for blood. Hattie moved beside him, her hand again dipping into that mysterious apron. What if I told you Morrison's been forging deeds for years? Stealing from the grieving, from the desperate. Garrett's face hardened. Then I'd say you better have proof, because an accusation like that can get you killed if you're wrong. Hattie's smile was thin and sharp. Oh, Sheriff, we have more than proof. We have witnesses. And just like that, they began to appear. Old Henrik Larsson, the Norwegian widower who'd stopped speaking to most folks after his wife passed, came first. And behind him, 3 more men stepped forward from the prairie haze. Familiar faces, long forgotten by Silas in the fog of his mourning. Ghosts of the town's truth, finally ready to speak. 2 women from town stepped up behind the crowd, the postman's widow and the seamstress who'd sewn Martha Whitmore's burial dress. We heard riders heading this way, said Henrik, his accent thick, his pale eyes hard as hammered steel. Figured if Morrison's men were troubling you, they'd be knocking on our doors next. Sheriff Garrett scanned the gathering crowd. What began as unease in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward something like hope. You sure about this, Henrik? The sheriff asked. Morrison's got powerful friends. Henrik's jaw tightened. Morrison stole my land, he replied. Claimed my Anna signed papers before she died. But Anna couldn't write, not even her name. I taught her to mark an X. Somehow, Morrison's got documents with a signature that isn't hers, giving him rights to our water. The seamstress stepped forward, voice trembling. He took the Miller farm last spring. Said it was over gambling debts, but those debts never existed. 3 days later, John Miller found his wife hanging in the barn. She couldn't live with losing everything her family built. A chill passed through Silas. The Millers lived just 5 miles south. He'd bought seed and salt from John not a year ago. Martha used to speak fondly of Mrs. Miller, saying her preserves were the best in 3 counties. How many? Garrett asked, barely above a whisper. 17 families, Cora answered. In just the last 2 years. All of them trapped by the same schemes. Forged papers, phantom debts, and no strength left to fight. Hattie reached into her apron again, but this time pulled out a thick bundle tied with ribbon. Women talk, Sheriff. Recipes, sure. Gossip, yes. But also grief. And when you listen close, patterns emerge. She handed the bundle to Garrett. As he began to read, his face darkened page by page, until even the wind seemed to pause. Sweet Jesus, he muttered. This is fraud going back 5 years. Forgery. Land theft. Extortion. He looked up at the people gathered before him. This could bury Morrison, and half the territorial government. Could, Mercy said, her tone sharp. But only if we move before Morrison knows we've got the truth. As if summoned by her words, the sound of pounding hooves rolled up from the road. But this wasn't a trio of hired thugs. It was the thunder of over a dozen riders, approaching in tight formation. Daisy Flynn, watching from the barn roof, shouted down in alarm. Federal marshals, riding Morrison's colors alongside their badges. Garrett clutched the bundle to his chest and turned to the crowd, his voice low and steady. Looks like we're about to find out if justice still means anything. The riders crested the ridge like a dust storm swallowing the sun. And at the front rode Morrison himself, sitting tall in his saddle, wearing the smug grin of a man who thought he'd already won. Morrison reined in 20 feet from the group. Sheriff Garrett, he called. I trust you're here to arrest these trespassers and return order to my property. Garrett stepped forward, hand resting near his holster. Your property? Funny, Morrison. Last I checked, this land belonged to Silas Whitmore. Morrison's smile didn't falter. Not anymore. Mr. Whitmore defaulted on substantial loans. The bank foreclosed. I purchased it lawfully. These people are trespassers, and I expect them removed. A federal marshal dismounted. Tall, weathered, eyes weary. "Sheriff, we've got warrants. Fraud. Conspiracy. Theft. We're here for these women." But Silas saw something shift. A tilt in the wind toward justice. Garrett reached into his vest, retrieved Hattie's bundle, and handed it to the marshal. "Marshal Kane," he said, "you might want to review this first. We've got our own investigation brewing." Kane's brow furrowed as he flipped through the papers. Morrison's mask slipped, just briefly, before he regained composure. "Sheriff, these women are criminals," Morrison said sharply. "Artistes. Widower hunters. Those documents? Forgeries." Hattie stepped forward, voice clear and defiant. "Like these." She produced another set of documents from her apron. "Loan filings." Morrison submitted himself. "See the dates, Marshal?" Kane studied them, his face darkening. "These are dated 3 months after Mrs. Whitmore's death. Claims she signed for loans." While in the ground, the silence cracked like brittle ice. Morrison paled beneath his polished exterior. "Clerical error," he said coldly. "Easily corrected. The debts are real." Then Cora stepped forward and everything changed. "Marshal Kane," she said, "my name is Cora Maddox. But 20 years ago I was Cora Morrison. That man on the horse is my husband, the one who's been telling people I was dead." A thunderclap of revelation. "You're supposed to be dead," Morrison spat. "I made sure of it." Kane's hand went to his weapon as realization dawned. But before anyone could act, Morrison spurred his horse, reaching inside his coat. Silas moved without thinking, stepping in front of Cora, shielding her with his body. And in that moment, the broken man overcome by grief became someone with something to protect, someone willing to live again. The gunshot split the air, but it wasn't Morrison who fired. Sheriff Garrett's bullet struck true, knocking Morrison from his saddle. The dust settled, the lie exposed, and Morrison's empire began to collapse. 6 months later, the Whitmore Ranch had changed. The 7 women still lived there, but now it echoed with laughter, healing, and a kind of chosen family Silas never imagined he'd know again. The land stolen from 17 families was returned. Morrison's corruption, once hidden behind law and wealth, was dragged into the light and destroyed. And Silas Whitmore, once a man undone by grief, learned the quiet, life-altering truth that love, when shared, isn't diminished, it grows.